In the year 1894, within the mist-laden hills of Scotland, two young souls disappeared from a remote Highland village, leaving not a single clue behind. The villagers murmured ancient tales of Black Annis, a cave-dwelling crone whose iron claws tore through the fog as she stalked her prey. When shepherd Angus Mloud discovered newly etched gashes deep into the mountain stone, he realized the legends held bitter truth. 6 men ascended to the cave on Creek Dub. Only 2 returned. Here lies the revelation from the abyss. And should you crave more tales of the unknown, subscribe for further journeys. This is their testimony. Above all else, the scent of damp wool and peat smoke remains etched in my memory, a peculiar fusion found only in the Highlands when autumn grows harsh and the mist envelops all like a funeral shroud. That aroma signaled the urgent task of herding sheep from the high pastures before the first bitter frost trapped us in winter's grip. It foretold endless days, tallying flocks, and even longer nights tormented by doubts whether the count was accurate. Yet in 1894, that same scent came to symbolize something far darker, though we remained ignorant of its true meaning. The odor became forever linked with terror, a unique breed of dread surfaces. When you grasp that the cautionary tales your grandmother breathed in hushed tones were not mere fables to prevent childhood straying. I am Angus Mloud, and by that time, I had roamed these peaks as a shepherd for almost 15 years. Aged 28, my hands had already become twisted like ancient tree roots from labor, and my face was darkened and roughened like saddle leather from the relentless wind. I arrived from Glasgow as a mere lad, dispatched to my uncle's farm following my father's demise in the shipyards. The city was never my place. Its clamor and crowding suffocated me. The Highlands granted room to inhale, even if that air half the year was cold enough to sear your lungs. The hamlet of O'More, nestled in a slender valley between 2 ridges, housing perhaps 40 souls in total, with stone cottages roofed in slate. There was a church that also served as the school, McTavish's shop, where we procured salt, sugar, tobacco, and the Boar's Head Inn, where Finlay Ross poured whiskey potent enough to strip paint and mutton stew so hearty it could revive the deceased. Every soul knew every other, and every secret was an open book. Such was the nature of our community, so remote that Edinburgh felt as distant as the moon, yet so interconnected that a newcomer was detected instantly upon cresting the ridge. The first to vanish was young Robbie Campbell, though at first we hesitated to label it as disappearance. 8 years old, with fiery hair and a gap-toothed smile, perpetually underfoot during chores. His mother Moira explained he had ventured to inspect the snares in the eastern woods. When he failed to return by nightfall, she presumed he had become disoriented in the fog, a common mishap, even for those born to the land. His father grabbed a lantern and set out in search. He discovered the snares undisturbed, with no trace of the child. By dawn, half the village was scouring those woodlands. I joined Duncan Kerr, the finest tracker across 3 valleys, a man who could discern a deer's thoughts from the imprint of its hooves. We discovered Robbie's cap beside the ancient limestone caves atop Dub, the Black Crag. Nothing more, no torn fabric, no blood, no footprints departing. Duncan crouched in the ferns for almost an hour, his leathery face turning pallid as gruel. "There ought to be tracks," he finally uttered. His tone dropped to a hush, as men's voices do when fear grips them, but pride forbids confession. "The ground is soft from rain. There should be footprints from him, and from whatever seized him. Perhaps he crawled into the cave," I proposed. though skepticism weighed my words. He might have fallen, struck his head. Duncan slowly shook his head. He gestured toward the cave's entrance. A dark gash in the limestone, some 20 feet up the cliff. Observe the brambles at the opening. Unbroken, unbent. Nothing has passed through there for weeks. We descended and reported this to the search party. The minister, Reverend McPherson, proposed organizing a formal expedition into the caves. But Duncan drew me aside. "I have observed markings up there," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Around the cave, scratches etched into the stone." "From what?" He held my gaze for a prolonged moment, his eyes darting toward the other villagers before returning to me. "My grandmother used to recount tales of the Glastig, of the Bean Neag, and warned that entities dwell in these mountains, older than the very rocks." He hesitated, then added, "And she had yet another name for it. Black Annis declared her home was the caves, where she devoured children." I, too, had heard the stories everyone knew of the blue-faced crone with iron claws who scraped out caves with her bare hands and tanned human skins. These tales were meant to keep children away from cliff edges and dark holes. I had never given them another thought beyond that. "Duncan, the boys are lost and frightened out there. Maybe injured. We cannot waste time on fairy stories." But he grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it hurt. "Those scratches in the rock, Angus, are deep, cut clean through limestone, and they are fresh. The search lasted 3 days, but we found nothing, and Moira Campbell stopped eating and stopped speaking. She just sat in her cottage, staring out the eastern window, waiting for a red-headed boy who would not come home. The village tried to move on. What else could we do? Life in the Highlands does not pause for grief. The sheep still needed tending. The peat still needed cutting. And winter still arrived, whether you were ready or not. But then the Murray girl vanished. 10 years old, Margaret Murray. As clever as a fox and twice as quick, she had been gathering firewood not 200 yards from her family's cottage. Her father heard her singing one moment. Then silence. He found the bundle of sticks she had been carrying scattered across the path, as if she had dropped them in sudden flight. That is when Finlay Ross spoke up. Finlay was nearly 60, had lived in Ochore his entire life, longer than anyone except old Mrs. Macduff, who was probably ancient when Rome fell. He gathered us in the Boar's Head that night, every man in the village, and some women too, though Reverend McPherson frowned at that. The peat fire burned in the hearth, and Finlay poured whiskey with a shaking hand. "My father's father saw her," he said without preamble. "In 1812, during the year of the bad harvest, 3 children went missing that autumn. They found bones in the caves on Creb. Small bones, child-sized, picked clean. That is enough," Reverend McPherson snapped. "We will not frighten people with superstitious nonsense." But Finlay ignored him. They organized a hunt, 20 men with torches and firearms. They entered those caves. He took a long drink. 12 came back out. They would not speak of what they had seen. My grandfather was one of them, and he never went within a mile of that crag again. But he told my father one thing, made him promise to remember it. He said, "She is real. Black Annis is real, and she is hungry in the autumn." The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the glen, and somewhere in the darkness, the sheep called to each other, their voices thin and frightened. Duncan Kerr stood up. "I am going up there tomorrow to the caves with a rifle and rope and lamp oil, Anyone who wants to call me a fool can do it to my face now, and I will thank you for it. But I am going. I should have stayed silent. I should have thought of my uncle's farm, of the spring lambing season, of all the practical reasons to let other men chase shadows. But I thought of Robbie Campbell's cap lying in the bracken, of Margaret Murray's scattered firewood, of how Duncan's voice had gone quiet when he said there should have been tracks. I will go with you, I heard myself say. By the time the meeting broke up, 6 of us had volunteered: Duncan, myself, Finley Ross despite his age, young Thomas Grant, who was trying to prove something to his father, and 2 brothers named Ian and Malcolm Scott, who worked the quarry and feared nothing they could hit with a sledgehammer. Reverend McPhersonson called us fools and sinners, told us we were feeding panic with superstition. But I saw the fear in his eyes too. He knew what we all knew, what we had been trying not to say out loud. Something was hunting in our mountains, something that took children and left no trace, something that lived in the darkness of Craig Dubh and had been there waiting and hungry longer than anyone could remember. We made our plans for dawn. None of us slept that night. The morning came gray and cold with mist thick enough to chew. We met outside McTavish's store just as the first pale light bled into the eastern sky. Duncan had brought rope, good hemp rope, the kind that held ships to dock. We each carried oil lamps, though in that fog, they barely pushed back the darkness more than a few feet. The Scott brothers brought their quarry hammers. Thomas Grant had his father's old military rifle, powder horn slung across his chest. I had borrowed a shotgun from my uncle, loaded with heavy shot meant for boar. Finley carried nothing but a dirk, the kind Highland men had carried for centuries. He said if we got close enough to use it, firearms would not matter anyway. The path up to Craig Dubh was not really a path at all, just a sheep track that wound through heather and gorse over tumbled stones slick with moss. The higher we climbed, the thicker the mist became until we walked through a gray world where sounds came muffled and strange. Our boots crunched on frost-stiffened grass. Our breath plumed white behind us. The village disappeared completely, swallowed by the fog, as though it had never existed. My grandmother often claimed the mist was her shroud, and Finley's voice echoed strangely through the still air, saying that Black Annis wore the fog like other women wore scarves, enabling her to seize what she desired without being observed. Your grandmother had many tales, Malcolm Scott muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. We had all grown up hearing those stories, and most of us set aside childhood fears as we matured, realizing the world already contains enough genuine horrors without inventing more. We ascended that misty mountain with 2 children already vanished, the calm, the Kandritha, no rational explanation for their loss. Yet those old tales resurfaced with renewed weight. Duncan stopped abruptly, raising a fist, and we froze as he stared at the ground, his weathered face turning pale. "Here," he whispered. "Look at this." We gathered where he pointed, in the soft earth between stones, clear as day. Despite the fog, there were marks, not exactly footprints, but something stranger. Long furrows in the ground, 4 parallel, each about as wide as my thumb. They were deep, cut right through the turf to the rock below. Their spacing matched no animal I knew, too wide for a cat, too narrow for a bear. Not that bears had been in Scotland for 2 centuries. "Claws," Thomas Grant whispered. The words seemed to echo despite the muffling fog. Duncan nodded slowly, knelt, and placed his hand next to the marks. His entire hand fit between just 2 of them. Whatever made these walks on 2 legs, see how they're grouped? 4 gouges, then a space, then 4 more. That's a stride. A walking stride. Could be old, Ian, Scott said hopefully. Could be from weeks ago. But Duncan was already shaking his head. He touched the edge of one gouge where the earth had been torn. The soil is still damp inside the cuts. These were made recently. Within hours, we stood there in the gray morning, 6 grown men with weapons and rope, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a boy afraid of the dark. That primitive hindbrain certainty that something was watching us, that we were being weighed and measured by unseen eyes. "We keep going," Duncan said, but his voice had changed flat, like a man who had already accepted he might not come down from the mountain. The track marks led upward, following the sheep path almost exactly, as if whatever made them knew the easiest route through the rocks. We found more as we climbed, scratches on stones where something had dragged its terrible claws for balance. A tuft of wool caught on a thorn bush, torn free rather than plucked, and once, a press into a patch of mud. It might have been a handprint if hands came with fingers twice as long as any human's and ended in curved black nails. The cave mouth loomed out of the mist like a wound in the rock face. It was exactly as I remembered from the search days before, a dark slash about 20 feet up, surrounded by brambles and tough mountain grass. But standing here now, with those claw marks leading straight toward it, the cave seemed different, malevolent. The darkness inside looked thick, almost solid, the kind of darkness that pushes back against light rather than yielding to it. "There," Finley said, pointing. Around the cave entrance, carved into the limestone, were more scratches, hundreds, thousands maybe, layered over each other like the walls of a cell where a prisoner had been counting days. Some were old, weathered smooth by rain and wind. Others looked fresh. The exposed stone, still pale where the surface had been scraped. They formed patterns, not random marks, but deliberate gouges that seemed almost like writing. If writing came from a mind that thought in angles and curves no human language had ever used. "She marks her territory," Finley whispered. "Like a beast marks a tree." We rigged the rope to a boulder, and Duncan went up first, his boots finding purchase on the limestone as if he'd been born climbing. The rest of us followed one by one, the rope burning through my palms, even through my gloves. And Thomas Grant came last, his rifle strapped across his back, his face set in an expression of someone trying very hard not to think about what he was doing. The cave mouth was wide enough for 2 men to enter abreast, but only if they stooped. The smell hit us before we'd gone 3 feet inside a thick, rotten, sweet stench like meat gone bad in summer heat, and all of us gagged. Malcolm Scott actually turned and retched over the edge, his breakfast spattering on the rocks below. "Jesus Christ," Ian Scott breathed. "What is that?" "Death," Duncan said simply. He'd lit his lamp, and in its guttering light, I could see his face had gone the color of old parchment. "That's the smell of death." We moved deeper. The cave widened after the initial passage, opening into a chamber maybe 30 feet across. Our lamps pushed back the darkness reluctantly, revealing walls that glistened with moisture and something else, something dark and crusted that could have been mud but wasn't. The floor crunched under our boots. Thomas Grant bent down, holding his lamp low. And when he straightened, his hands were shaking so badly the lamp flame danced. "Bones," he whispered. The ground beneath them was blanketed in skeletal remains. The most horrifying detail was their size, all so tiny, fragile like avian remains, pale as limestone, except where time and unmentionable stains had darkened them. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, piled so densely that in spots they resembled snowbanks along the stone, with finger bones, toe bones, delicate ribcage fragments, and scattered skulls with hollow orbits gazing into the void, jaws locked in perpetual, silent shrieks. "Oh God!" Finley choked, his voice cracking. "Oh God, their children. Every single one." The cavern descended further. At its rear, a corridor plunged into an impenetrable blackness our lanterns could not breach. From that abyss arose a noise muffled, moist, akin to a massive creature, slumbering and drawing breath. Beneath that, a second sound emerged, a measured clicking, steady and persistent, as if elongated nails drummed on rock. "She's here," Duncan murmured. "She's below, and she's aware of our presence." We ought to have fled. All primal urges howled for us to reverse course, clamber back up the cord, and flee to the settlement without ever glancing behind. Yet we journeyed in pursuit of truth, propelled by the disappearance of 2 children, perhaps still hidden within this ossuary. They might yet live, awaiting souls brave enough to confront the gloom. Duncan stepped ahead. I seized his arm. "Hold on. We require a strategy. We need." The respiration ceased. In the abrupt stillness, we perceived it unmistakably. The clicking transformed into motion. Something ascended from the abyss. A colossal entity advanced through the shadows with dreadful intent, its form grating against the rocky walls. The staccato tapping of talons on stone echoed. Then another sound, a voice, if such a term applies. An utterance that teetered between speech and the wail of a predatory feline, articulating phonemes from a tongue not designed for human vocalization. Thomas Grant lifted his rifle. His fingers had stilled, slipping into that serenity born when fear shatters, leaving nothing but resolve. "Ignite your lanterns," he murmured. "Every single one. I wish to behold what we are slaying." The clicking intensified, drew nearer. And then, at the boundary of our illumination, where shadow commenced its sovereign reign, something stirred. We glimpsed it, a mere flicker, sufficient to freeze our blood into icy rivers. A form that might have been female, were women 8 feet tall and twisted at every articulation. Epidermis, the hue of a cadaver, 3 days deceased. Limbs excessively elongated, dangling near the earth, terminating in those dreadful talons we had pursued since dawn. And its visage, heaven save us the face, a bruised blue-black, drawn too taut across a cranium that was nearly human yet not fully, an overly broad maw packed with teeth resembling corroded spikes, eyes that seized our lantern glow and hurled it back at us, pallid, ravenous, thoroughly insane. "Black Annis!" she shrieked. And that cry fulfilled every tale's warning. More terrifying still, the rifle blast thundered in the confined chamber, gunpowder flare illuminating the cavern like a storm flash. Thomas discharged without a moment's delay. I observed the being recoil as the projectile impacted its midsection. Yet it did not collapse, did not even decelerate. Instead, it lunged forward in a skittering surge of impossible velocity, scuttling quadrupedally like a spider large as a human. "Retreat," Duncan bellowed. "All of you, back to the opening." We stumbled backward, footwear slipping over osseous fragments that broke and fractured underfoot. Malcolm Scott swung his mallet as the creature sprang past him, connecting somewhere along its elongated limbs. The impact registered, I heard osseous cracks. Yet, the entity merely contorted aside and pressed onward. Its talons raked the rock, sparking against the light, while that dreadful wailing lament continued ceaselessly from its throat. Ian Scott proved too slow. The being's limb lashed out at a pace that eluded vision. Those metallic talons raked his thorax. His garment parted in 4 precise slits, and blood inky under the lantern spattered the cavern wall. He emitted a piercing, dreadful shriek and collapsed heavily amidst the remains. His sibling Malcolm unleashed an inarticulate roar and launched himself at the entity, swinging his hammer. This blow landed squarely on what served as its cranium. The being's skull wrenched aside with a sound like splitting sapling wood. It wavered momentarily, its pallid eyes rolling. Malcolm struck repeatedly, forcing it backward into the profound blackness. I knelt beside him, my palms applying pressure to his lacerations. The gashes were profound. I glimpsed pale ribs shining through shredded tissue. His gaze was dilated and terrified, his respiration moist and gurgling. "Lift him," Duncan ordered. Thomas Finley added, "Provide cover, Angus. Assist me with him." We lifted Ian upright, his arms draped across our shoulders, his blood seeping warm through my coat. Behind us, Malcolm continued his assault, forcing the beast backward with measured strikes of his hammer. Yet I realized now, it was not yielding out of fear. The creature lured him farther into the depths, pulling him from our presence. With a cunning more terrifying than fangs or talons, it isolated him from the rest. "Malcolm!" Duncan cried out. "Malcolm, retreat!" But Malcolm Scott could no longer hear. His brother was perishing in our grasp, and fury consumed him as it does certain souls, transforming them into a relentless, fearsome force. He chased the creature into the black void. We listened to the repeated blows of his hammer, the beast's howls, Malcolm's own enraged cries. Then a scream pierced the silence. This was no war cry. A shriek of absolute dread abruptly silenced. The hammer clattered against rock, rolled, and halted, then quiet interrupted only by that moist respiration and the gentle tap, tap, tap of claws on stone. "We have to leave," I said. My own voice sounded alien to me, strained and shrill. "Duncan, we must depart immediately." Ian was only half aware, his head swaying against my shoulder. We began retreating toward the cave mouth, Thomas and Finley aiming their weapons at the shadows into which Malcolm had vanished. At some moment, my lamp had extinguished. I did not recall letting it fall. In the dim glow from the others, the shadows appeared to shift on their own, twisting and grasping like sentient beings. In the profound dark, something was pulled across the stone floor. Something weighty, something that could have been a corpse. "Faster," Duncan commanded. Though his tone was calm, I observed his trembling hands on the rope. "Reach the rope, Angus. Descend first with Ian. We will lower him to you." We arrived at the cavern entrance. The pale daylight outside appeared blinding after the interior gloom. Even as it passed through the fog, I spotted the rope dangling down the rocky cliff. I could see the rocks beneath and Deliverance a mere 20 feet distant. At that moment, the creature attacked. It burst from the inner tunnel like a cannonball, accelerating to a blur. Finley spun around, the dagger glinting in his grip, yet he was an aged man facing a youthful nightmare. The talons swept across his neck, his blood splattered the wall in a mist, and he collapsed, silently. The blade slipped from his lifeless hand. Thomas discharged his weapon. The bullet struck the beast in the shoulder, twisting it, and in the full illumination, I saw it distinctly, for the first time. The tales had not deceived me. Every dreadful aspect was accurate. The bluish-black hide, pulled taut over unnatural skeletal structures, its arms, extending beyond its knees, were sinewy like steel cables. The appendages, if they could be named hands, had fingers that were excessively long and articulated too many joints. They terminated in those metallic black talons that had excavated this cavern through ages of persistent scraping. And the countenance loared above, the face, a woman's visage distorted and warped into a grotesque parody of humanity. Its maw gaped wide enough to sever a child's head entirely, lined with teeth resembling sharpened spikes. Yet its eyes were the most terrifying they were human eyes. Insane, ravenous, ageless, beyond reckoning, yet undeniably human. Whatever Black Annis once was, she had been a woman. And a tiny fragment of her still recalled that. She gazed at us, truly gazed with a cunning that was more dreadful than brute violence. Then she spoke. The syllables emerged, fragmented and distorted, formed by lips that had not uttered human speech for an eternity beyond my comprehension. Yet they were indeed words. "Mine," she rasped. "The children belong to me, forever mine. Surrendered to the mountain, surrendered to the darkness." Duncan acted without delay. He seized the rope and shoved me toward it. "Go, get Ian down and flee to the village. Do not pause. Do not glance behind. Duncan, go." I moved. I clutched the rope with one hand, Ian's burden pulling on my opposite arm, and began descending. Overhead, I perceived Thomas shooting once more. I heard Duncan yelling words I could not distinguish. The rope seared across my palm, lacerating the skin, yet I felt nothing. I simply continued moving hand over fist, Ian's blood raining down upon me from above. We struck the ground, and I almost crumbled beneath Ian's mass. He was now unconscious, his respiration so faint I could hardly discern his chest rise. I glanced upward. Thomas was descending the rope rapidly, his complexion pale as parchment. Behind him, within the cavern opening, I glimpsed Duncan. He had severed the rope. The cut end dropped past Thomas, who frantically sought grips on the cliffside. Duncan remained at the cave opening, blade in one hand, turned toward the shadows, confronting the beast that was even then emerging behind him, those dreadful talons extending outward. He cried out to us, "Take care of them. Tell everyone she exists. Warn them to keep far from these peaks. Tell them." Then Black Annis seized him from behind. Her talons pierced his spine and burst forth from his chest. Slick and crimson, Duncan's eyes bulged, his lips parted in a silent cry. She pulled him back into the cave, into the abyss, and he vanished. Thomas tumbled. The final 10 feet landed him rolling. Then he sprang to his feet and ran. We jointly bore Ian down the slope, slipping on unstable gravel, tripping across the heather as fog enveloped us like a burial cloth. From the cave behind, a noise emerged, a victorious howl, perhaps, or a satisfied appetite, or merely the wind weaving through stone. I never glanced back to confirm. The townsfolk spotted our approach and intercepted us midway up the valley. They relieved us of Ian, yet I realized even then it was futile. He perished before reaching his home, bleeding out on the trail while his wife clasped his hand, and their 3 children stared with wide, unknowing eyes. We recounted everything, every unbelievable particular, all the dreadful realities. Reverend McPhersonson branded us deceivers and lunatics, claiming we had panicked and attacked one another in the darkness. Yet I glimpsed the terror in his gaze. He understood, and everyone secretly knew what dwelled within those highlands. Robbie Campbell's corpse was discovered 3 days afterward, washed ashore in the stream beneath Crube. What remained of him? Margaret Murray was never recovered, nor were Malcolm Scott, Finley Ross, or Duncan Kerr. Several courageous individuals ventured to the cave, yet they reached only the mouth. The rope had vanished, either removed or obliterated. We remained uncertain, yet the markings on the stone persisted fresh, deeply etched, possibly a caution or a pledge. The hamlet endeavored to continue, but what alternative did we have? However, households with offspring began departing individually, inventing pretexts to relocate to Glasgow, Edinburgh, or any place not overshadowed by that dark cliff. Come winter, a core possessed merely half its original populace. By spring, that number halved once more. Now, 3 decades later, only remnants and recollections remain, along with sheep that refuse to pasture within a mile of that site. I also departed eventually, returning to Glasgow, securing employment in the shipyards just as my father had done before me. Yet occasional dreams of that cavern visit me, those pallid, ravenous eyes in the dark, that voice rasping phrases that no human larynx ought ever to utter. I still recall the moist noise of Duncan's final exhale as the talons pierced him. People claim black anise is merely folklore, a narrative to scare youngsters. The learned scholars in their universities mock such superstitions. Yet I was present. I beheld her. I gazed into those insane yet human eyes and comprehended that certain cravings predate civilization. They are older than compassion, older than anything we would deem human. And I am certain she remains in her cavern on Creag Dubh. She continues carving her symbols into the rock. She persists in awaiting autumn, when hunger compels her to descend into the valleys and claim what the mountain yields. The children, always the children, they belong to her, she declared, offered to the mountain, surrendered to the darkness. I beseech God that she is content with what she seized. I plead that the lives of 5 men and the deaths of 2 children purchase tranquility for whatever duration remains. Yet, I lack faith in that. Occasionally, late at night, when the wind wails, as only the Highlands can, I perceive her voice within my dreams. Mine, she murmurs, forever mine. And I awaken, screaming.